The bells of St. Crispin's had not rung so hesitantly in years. The verger blamed the damp, though it might equally have been the bell-ringer's gout. Either way, the tone of the morning, both literal and moral, was uncertain. Mrs. Millicent Fanshawe, widow of the late councillor Herbert Fanshawe, was to be buried that Thursday. Flaxborough, with its usual appetite for both ceremony and speculation, had assembled accordingly. The church smelt faintly of lavender, floor polish, and old ambition. The widow had been a familiar figure in the better aisles of the town, chairwoman of the Floral Society, scourge of the Christmas Bazaar Committee, and reputed to have once corrected the Archdeacon's Latin mid-sermon. At 11 minutes to noon, the vicar, Reverend Copplestone, consulted his pocket-watch and frowned. The coffin had not yet arrived. The mourners, in various stages of decorous grief, were rustling and whispering like pigeons in a loft. Then, just as the organist began his third involuntary reprise of Abide With Me, a black van from Morrow and Sons, undertakers, Estuary 1864, rolled up. Inside were two solemn men, one old enough to remember Queen Mary's funeral, the other young enough to confuse hearse with horse in polite conversation. They bore the coffin down the aisle with the practised caution of those who had done it often, but never quite grown comfortable with it. "Late start, Mr. Morrow," murmured the vicar. "Traffic, sir," said Morrow. A horse-box overturned by the bypass. "Entirely out of our hands." "Quite," said the vicar, glancing at the clock again as though to confirm the horse's complicity. The coffin was placed upon the trestles. There was the usual shuffling and a few discreet coughs from mourners who found the act reassuring. Then Morrow lifted the lid a fraction, to ensure, he later explained, that all was in order before the formal sealing. He looked down, he looked again. Then, in a small, strangled voice that no one had heard from him before or since, he said, "Oh, merciful heavens!" The vicar peered over. His pince-nez nearly fell into the void. "Good Lord, man," he whispered hoarsely. "Where is she?" "Gone, sir," said Morrow, pale as marble. "The coffin's empty." For several seconds there was no sound but the organist, who had obligingly begun a fourth verse to mask what he assumed was a wardrobe malfunction. Then the whispering began. Miss Gudgeon from the post office was first to break ranks. "Empty?" she mouthed to Mrs. Glossop, as in not there. Mrs. Glossop, who had never in her life resisted a chance to magnify the improbable, nodded gravely. "Vanished," she said, as though the dead woman had performed a parlour trick. By the time the first half-hour had elapsed, the news had reached the churchyard, the High Street, and the ladies' tea-room, where a spirited argument was already underway as to whether the coffin had ever contained a body at all. Meanwhile, in the vestry, Reverend Copplestone, Morrow, and Inspector Purbright of the County Constabulary were examining the coffin as though it were a particularly unconvincing piece of modern art. Purbright had arrived quietly, as was his way. A tall man of placid aspect, with eyes that took in more than they gave out. He looked at the gleaming mahogany box, then at the bewildered faces of the two men beside him. "No sign of tampering?" he asked mildly. "None, Inspector." "Sealed as per regulation," said Morrow, wringing his hat. "We closed it at the mortuary last night. My nephew checked it himself." "Your nephew?" "Yes, sir." "Young Stanley." "Keen lad, perhaps." "Too keen, indeed." Purbright's voice was neutral, but his eyes rested for a second longer on the undertaker's trembling hands. "And Mrs. Fanshawe's remains were definitely placed within?" Morrow nodded miserably. "Saw her with my own eyes, sir." "All proper." The vicar cleared his throat. "Could there have been an administrative oversight?" Purbright's expression softened slightly, as though at a joke only he had heard. "It would be a remarkable sort of oversight, Reverend. Most people are rather particular about where their deceased end up." Outside, the murmurs had swelled into a low hum. Someone had already telephoned the Flaxborough Chronicle, whose editor was reportedly sharpening his pencil with glee. Purbright replaced the lid, pressing it down gently. "Best we take this to the mortuary again." Quietly, if possible. Quietly, repeated the vicar aghast. Inspector, this is the most indecorous thing ever to occur in my church. Purbright looked at him with mild sympathy. Then I suppose, sir, you're overdue for some excitement. He turned to the constable at the door. Best fetch Stanley Morrow. Ask him to bring his delivery records. As the constable hurried out, Purbright glanced once more at the coffin. It gleamed under the vestry light, empty, immaculate, and faintly smug, as though aware of the disturbance it had caused. He sighed, straightened his tie, and said softly, "Flaxborough, you do keep finding ways to surprise me." By the time Inspector Purbright returned to the station that afternoon, the story of the widow's empty coffin had grown legs, wings, and possibly a small brass band. Flaxborough's High Street hummed with a mixture of horror and delight. The tragedy of a missing corpse was precisely the kind of excitement that could be discussed with moral indignation over a pot of Assam at Mrs. Glossop's tea-room. Where scandal was served with scones and double cream, the conversation was brisk. "I said to her," Mrs. Glossop declared, ladling sugar into her cup with the solemnity of a coroner, "I said, Millicent Fanshawe was always a woman who liked to make an entrance. But I didn't expect her to improve on it by making an exit as well." Her companions laughed, then immediately caught themselves, lowering their voices and glancing about in case divine retribution, or the vicar's wife, was listening. At the next table, Councillor Pomfret dabbed his lips with a napkin, his expression as tight as a purse string. "We cannot have this sort of thing," he muttered to his wife. "It reflects upon the entire borough. One expects better class of corpse handling in Flaxborough." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Pomfret, who was blessed with both candour and cake crumbs. "One should have expected better from Mrs. Fanshawe. She was never one to lie still for long." By 4 o'clock, the Chronicle office had released an unofficial bulletin suggesting grave robbery, spiritual interference, or possibly bureaucratic error in equal measure. The paperboy's shrill cries of "widow's body vanished" made the incident sound like an afternoon matinee. Purbright, however, was not reading the Chronicle. He was in his office, studying a neat folder of statements. Sergeant Malley, red-faced and eager, stood nearby holding a mug of tea that trembled faintly. "Morrow swears blind the coffin left his premises with the body inside, sir." His nephew confirms. Purbright nodded. "Did the nephew also confirm whether he sealed it himself?" "Yes, sir. Says he used standard brass fittings." "No chance of anyone opening it without tools." Purbright set down his pen. "Tools which he presumably possesses," Malley blinked. "You think young Stanley had something to do with it?" "I think," Purbright replied mildly, "that whenever something is misplaced, it's as well to begin by questioning the person who last touched it. Human nature tends to leave fingerprints of a conversational sort." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Pym, the police secretary, entered with her usual air of brisk confidentiality. "Beg pardon, Inspector, but there's a Mrs. Glossop outside who insists upon seeing you. Says she has information of a grave nature." Purbright's eyebrows rose. "Grave indeed. Very well, show her in." Mrs. Glossop entered, dressed for social war. She clutched her handbag like a witness box and spoke before she was seated. "Inspector, I'm not one to gossip, but in this case it's practically a duty." "I rely on public duty," Purbright said pleasantly. "Please, go on." "Well," she began, "yesterday afternoon I saw the undertaker's van parked behind the churchyard gate much later than it should have been. 5:15, I'd say. And this is the curious part. There was someone standing beside it. A woman in a hat. I didn't see her face, but she was tallish, wearing a grey coat. I thought it odd, what with visiting hours being over and all. Did she appear to be speaking to anyone?" "No, but she was holding something. A small case like a handbag, only stiffer. Like a briefcase?" "Exactly that, Inspector." Purbright thanked her, took her statement, and promised to look into the matter with suitable discretion. When she had gone, Malley leaned forward. "Woman with a briefcase, sir. Could it be connected to that solicitor fellow from Nottingham you mentioned?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Possibly. Or perhaps it's merely another resident who enjoys admiring coffins at twilight. Flaxborough breeds many harmless eccentricities. He rose and walked to the window. The town lay beneath a soft haze of chimney smoke and fading daylight. From here, Flaxborough always looked perfectly innocent, a picture postcard of English virtue. Yet Purbright had learned that behind every polished brass nameplate and well-trimmed hedge lay a potential novel of human absurdity. "Sir," Mally said tentatively, "shall I arrange to speak with the vicar again?" "Not yet. Let us give the good Reverend time to recover his faith in funerals. I'd prefer to begin with the morrows. Nepotism often buries more than the dead." Mally made a note and left. Purbright remained by the window, watching the gentle drift of townsfolk along the pavement, people who spoke softly, smiled politely, and lived as though wickedness had been politely outlawed. He thought of Mrs. Glossop's account, a woman in grey by the coffin van at dusk. A handbag or briefcase, stiff and deliberate. Might mean everything, or nothing at all. He stirred his tea absently, the spoon chiming against the cup like a small church bell. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Tea and outrage! One fuels the other rather nicely in this town." Outside, the last edition of the Chronicle flapped in the evening wind. The headlines screamed where the townspeople whispered, "Body snatchers in Flaxborough." Purbright smiled faintly. "Not yet," he murmured, "but give them until tomorrow." And he returned to his paperwork, where one empty coffin and one too many explanations waited for his quiet attention. The next morning found Inspector Purbright walking along the cobbled lane toward Morrow and Sons, the undertaker's establishment, whose air of perpetual mourning was only slightly undercut by the smell of furniture polish. The sign above the door read, "Dignity in Departure." Since 1864, though recent events had rather strained the slogan's credibility. Inside, the atmosphere was funereal in both profession and temperament. Mr. Ernest Morrow, senior partner, emerged from a side room where a muted wireless played hymn tunes. His face was long and solemn, like a man perpetually preparing to apologize to God. "Inspector Purbright," he greeted, voice low enough to suggest respect for both the dead and any potential customers. "We are mortified, absolutely mortified. In 59 years we've never misplaced so much as an urn." Purbright inclined his head. "An impressive record, Mr. Morrow, though I fear your recent performance may invite comparison with the postal service." The undertaker winced, as if struck by satire. "Sir, I can only assure you Mrs. Fanshaw's remains were present, and accounted for last I saw them. I oversaw the preparation myself. And your nephew?" "Yes, Stanley," a keen boy, took charge of sealing the coffin. "We had some administrative confusion that evening, but nothing out of the ordinary." "Administrative confusion?" "A mix-up in delivery labels, Inspector. We had another coffin scheduled for Friday, a Mr. Tyndale of Wimmersley. It seems the tags were briefly mislaid." Purbright watched him carefully. "Briefly?" "Yes, only a few minutes." "And during those few minutes both coffins were unattended?" Morrow hesitated, his eyes darting toward a curtain at the back of the room, behind which the workshop lay. "Technically, yes, though I can hardly imagine anyone taking advantage of such a moment." "People have taken advantage of far less, Mr. Morrow." The older man folded his hands, as if in prayer. "I can't think who would wish to interfere with the late Mrs. Fanshawe. She wasn't the sort to inspire affection." Purbright allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "You surprise me." "A pillar of the community, no?" "Indeed, sir. But pillars often cast long shadows." Before Purbright could reply, the curtain twitched, and a lanky young man appeared, 20 or so, with pale hair slicked flat and an expression combining guilt with eagerness. "Uncle, you wanted me?" "Stanley, this is Inspector Purbright," Morrow said, tone suggesting both pride and penance. "He's here about—" "The matter?" Stanley nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Terrible business." "I can't imagine how it happened." "I checked everything twice. Perhaps you can tell me," Purbright said gently. what time the coffin was loaded.
7:30, sir. I remember because I'd just locked up the side door when I heard the lorry start.
We took it straight to the church, Did anyone else come in or out between the sealing and the delivery? Stanley frowned.
Not that I saw, except...
Well, there was a gentleman. Said he was from the Chronicle. Purbright's tone sharpened slightly.
A journalist?
Yes, sir.
Asked about Mrs. Fanshaw's funeral arrangements.
Said he wanted a quote for the obituary section. Did he give a name? Stanley shook his head. No, sir. Had one of those little notebooks. Seemed in a hurry, and you told him? Just that the service was at noon, and that Mrs. Fanshawe had requested a closed coffin. He thanked me and left. Purbright regarded him steadily. Was the coffin already sealed when he came? Yes, sir. Just finished it. Morrow interjected. I told the lad not to speak to journalists, Inspector. They have a way of, embalming facts prematurely. Purbright gave a mild nod. Indeed, still it's curious timing. Did either of you notice a woman, grey coat, hat, near the premises that evening? Stanley blinked.
A woman? No, sir.
Just that gentleman.
Though he stopped, yes?
Well, there was a car parked across the street. Grey saloon. Couldn't see who was in it. Purbright made a note in his small, immaculate book.
And this was after closing time?
Just after, yes. He closed the notebook.
Thank you both. One last question, Mr. Morrow. Could anyone with the right nerve and knowledge open a sealed coffin unnoticed?
The undertaker looked affronted. It would be highly irregular, Inspector. Irregular? Purbright repeated softly. Is a word that covers much of my career. He left them standing amidst their draped curtains and scent of polish. Outside, the street was bright with early sun, the sort that made Flaxborough appear innocent again. He paused by a shop window displaying mourning veils, each tagged, reduced for clearance, and thought how commerce never wasted grief. Back at the station, Sergeant Malley was waiting with a half-eaten sandwich and the air of one who had been both reading and regretting the morning paper. They've printed another story, sir. Headline says, body stolen or never there. They're quoting an unnamed source from the church. Purbright sat, removed his hat, and gave a small sigh.
Unnamed sources are like ghosts. Malley, eager to be believed but seldom corporeal. He examined his notes. An undertaker, too eager to please. A nephew, too quick to explain.
A journalist without a name, and a woman in grey. The picture was forming, faintly like a photograph in a dark room. Sir, Malley ventured, what do you think happened? Purbright leaned back. I think, Sergeant, that Flaxborough's sense of decorum has once again collided with its sense of opportunity. Someone, somewhere, decided that a dead widow could serve a purpose more useful than remaining quietly buried. Malley frowned.
Why go to all that trouble?
Purbright smiled faintly.
Motive.
That elusive ingredient. It may be wrapped in money or vanity or love, though in Flaxborough it's usually disguised as respectability. He rose, adjusted his cuffs, and said, Let's pay a visit to Mrs. Fanshaw's house. The living, after all, tend to explain the dead far better than coffins do. As they stepped out into the street, the church bells struck 11, clear, precise, and oddly cheerful. For all the town's uproar, life in Flaxborough marched on exactly as before, politely scandalized and faintly self-satisfied. Purbright's gaze lingered on the grey clouds gathering in the distance. An empty coffin, he murmured. Now what's more troubling, what's missing inside or what someone meant to hide by removing it? He walked on, coat collar turned up, the faintest smile beneath his calm eyes, as though already sensing the first tremor of the truth beneath Flaxborough's polished surface. The Fanshawe residence, known locally as the Widow's Lodge, stood a little apart from the rest of Flaxborough's prim respectability. It was a narrow Georgian house with ivy climbing its brick face like faded handwriting, and a small front garden whose hedges appeared to have been trimmed by someone without enthusiasm but with considerable suspicion. A brass plate on the door read, Mrs. M. Fanshawe, its polish dulled, as though even the metal had gone into mourning. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Malley arrived in the early afternoon, greeted not by grief, but by the faint smell of furniture wax and closed rooms. The maid, a timid girl of indeterminate age and infinite nervousness, admitted them with a curtsy so shaky that it threatened to collapse into apology. "Miss Trent's in the drawing-room, sir," she whispered. "She's expecting you." Miss Phyllis Trent, the late widow's companion and general assistant in social matters, rose from her chair as they entered. She was a woman of about 40, neatly dressed in mourning black that looked suspiciously new. Her hair was drawn back with care, her expression serene in a way that only self-control or indifference could produce. "Inspector Purbright," she said, extending a gloved hand with the kind of composure that suggested she had long practiced for crises. "And Sergeant Malley, I presume."
"Please do sit."
"I've been expecting your visit." Purbright inclined his head and took the proffered seat. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Trent, particularly at such a delicate time." Her lips curved slightly. "There's been nothing delicate about it, Inspector. The whole affair has been rather brutal, if I may say so. To lose one's employer and then to find her coffin
unoccupied.
It has a macabre quality, even for Flaxborough." Malley fumbled with his notebook, but Purbright merely folded his hands. "You were close to Mrs. Fanshawe?" "For nearly 6 years. I assisted her with correspondence, managed her engagements, and, occasionally, offered companionship. Though Mrs. Fanshawe," she added with careful neutrality, "was not easily companioned. Yet you stayed." "I was well paid," Miss Trent said crisply. Then, perhaps realizing the bluntness of her tone, she added, "And I came to admire her strength. She was a woman of order. She liked things done properly." Purbright nodded.
"And lately? Had she seemed unsettled?"
There was the briefest flicker in Miss Trent's eyes.
"Unsettled? I wouldn't say that."
She'd been a little withdrawn, perhaps. There was talk of a small illness. Nothing serious, I thought. She spoke of making arrangements, setting things in order. I assumed she meant her estate. She mentioned these arrangements to you directly? Yes, she was expecting correspondence from her solicitor, Mr. Athelney of Nottingham. Purbright's glance met Malley's for an instant. "Ah, the same gentleman who has since written to us about the missing will." Miss Trent's expression didn't alter, but her teacup paused mid-air. "I wasn't aware the will was missing." "It is now," Purbright said mildly. "But tell me, did she speak of leaving Flaxborough?" That earned him another brief silence, the kind filled with the faint ticking of a mantel clock. "She mentioned it once," Miss Trent said at last, half-jokingly. "Something about wishing she could vanish for a while. Just disappear," she said, "so people might finally appreciate her absence." "How long before her death was that?"
"A week, perhaps less," Malley scribbled furiously.
Purbright, however, sat motionless, eyes resting on the glint of brass on the teapot lid. "And her death? She died here, I believe?" "Yes, peacefully, in her sleep. Dr. Baines certified it himself." "Was anyone else present?"
"Only me. I found her the next morning."
"She looked very calm, almost—"
"Relieved." Purbright studied her face.
"You've had a trying experience, Miss Trent. Is there anything you can think of, any visitor, letter, or odd remark that seemed unusual?" Miss Trent's tone grew faintly brittle. "I've already told the other officer everything. There was nothing unusual. Mrs. Fanshaw's life, though eventful in gossip, was perfectly regular, in fact." Purbright gave a small nod. Gossip, of course, often knows things facts are too polite to mention. She smiled faintly. "That may be true, Inspector. But in this house, gossip was discouraged. Mrs. Fanshawe preferred silence." Purbright rose, glancing around the room. It was orderly to the point of sterility, chairs precisely aligned, drapes symmetrically drawn, a single portrait of the late Councillor Fanshawe glaring down as though disappointed by both mortality and municipal taxes. He approached a side table, where a small silver box stood beside a stack of unopened letters. "May I?" he asked. "Of course," she said lightly, though her gaze didn't leave him. He lifted the lid. Inside were envelopes, each addressed in the same looping hand, to Mrs. Fanshawe, postmarked from Nottingham. Her solicitor again? Miss Trent nodded. She received several letters from him lately. Private ones, I gathered. Purbright replaced the box, his tone still mild. You didn't happen to see their contents? I did not. Mrs. Fanshawe valued discretion. He smiled. As do we all. One final question, Miss Trent. Did she own a grey coat? Her brow furrowed slightly. A grey coat? Yes, she did. Wore it often on errands. Why? Purbright only said, a witness thought she saw a woman of that description near the undertaker's van the night before the funeral. Miss Trent gave a quiet laugh, too quick to be natural. Then it can hardly have been her, can it? Hardly, Purbright agreed, though his gaze lingered on her gloved hands. As they took their leave, the maid hovered nervously in the hall. Beg pardon, sir, she whispered, but might you look at something? She held out a folded sheet of paper. Found this in the fire grate this morning, after Miss Trent burned the rubbish. Purbright unfolded it carefully. It was half a letter, scorched at the edges. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, bold and deliberate.
Once it's arranged, you'll have what's owed.
Make sure the lid stays sealed until after. I'll see you before the service. The signature was gone. Purbright refolded the paper, slipped it into his pocket and said quietly, Thank you. You've been most helpful. Outside, as the door closed behind them, Mally exhaled. Sir, that sounded like Mrs. Fanshawe writing. But to whom? Purbright glanced back at the curtained windows. Perhaps to the man who sealed her coffin, he said softly. Then, with that faintly ironic calm that marked his manner in all crises, he added, or to the one who promised to open it again. The following morning brought with it a quiet drizzle, the kind that softened Flaxborough's edges until the town looked like an old watercolour left too long in a damp frame. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, rereading the half-burned letter recovered from the fire grate at Widow's Lodge. The words were few but suggestive, arranged, what's owed, see you before the service. It was not the vocabulary of grief, but of transaction. Sergeant Mally entered, carrying a sheaf of papers and an expression of mild excitement. Morning post, sir. There's something here from the solicitor in Nottingham, Mr. Athelney. He sent copies of correspondence with Mrs. Fanshawe. Purbright gestured for him to sit. Read them aloud, if you please. Slowly. Mally cleared his throat. Dear Mrs. Fanshawe, he began, further to our discussion regarding the securities, I advise that the arrangement can proceed as you proposed, though I remain uneasy about your insistence on absolute confidentiality. The sum is considerable, and I must remind you that such transfers, though discreet, are not without risk. He paused. Sounds rather like something financial, sir. Indeed. Continue. I shall await your confirmation before authorizing the release of funds. Should you decide otherwise, please destroy this letter. Signed, Arthur Athelney, Solicitor at Law. Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. Destroy this letter. An unusual instruction from a man of legal temperament. And yet she did not. Curious. There's more, Mally said, flipping a page. Mrs. Fanshawe's reply, handwritten. Short. Proceed as discussed. The fewer names, the better. Purbright's gaze drifted toward the window, where rain streaked the glass. It appears, Sergeant, that our late widow was conducting private business. The question is, did she intend her death to simplify it? Mally looked puzzled.
You think she might have faked it, sir?
Purbright smiled faintly. I think people rarely vanish without reason. And Mrs. Fanshawe, by all accounts, was not a woman who enjoyed leaving matters unfinished. If she meant to go quietly, she'd have chosen a more discreet coffin. He stood, collecting the letters. We'll pay a visit to Dr. Baines. Let's see what the certifying physician recalls of his patient's final night. Dr. Baines lived in a square brick house whose curtains seemed perpetually drawn, as though light were a vulgar intrusion. He was a short, fretful man with a stethoscope perpetually draped about his neck, as if prepared for an emergency of conscience. Inspector, Sergeant, he said, ushering them in.
Still no trace of the body, I understand. Most irregular. I trust you don't think there was any medical negligence?
Nothing of the sort, Purbright assured him smoothly. Merely a few clarifications. Mrs. Fanshaw's death. Heart failure, was it? Indeed, peaceful. No sign of struggle or distress. Her companion, Miss Trent, called me early that morning. The body was cool when I arrived, suggesting death sometime during the night. Did you see her face clearly? Baines hesitated. Naturally, yes. She was pale as expected, but otherwise unchanged. The resemblance was exact. The resemblance? The doctor coughed into his handkerchief.
Slip of the tongue, Inspector. I meant to say she looked herself. Purbright's expression remained unreadable.
Quite. And you issued the death certificate without delay?
Of course.
I had no reason to suspect anything amiss. Mrs. Fanshawe had a weak heart, poor woman. She'd suffered fainting fits before. Did you see any signs of medication near the bedside? A small bottle, chloral hydrate, prescribed for sleep. Perfectly ordinary in her condition. Purbright thanked him and rose. One last thing, Doctor. Do you recall how Miss Trent seemed that morning? Composed, almost unnaturally so. She said she'd been expecting it, poor thing. I found her efficiency admirable. Back outside, Mally exhaled into the mist. She's at the heart of it, sir.
Miss Trent has to be.
Too calm by half, perhaps, Purbright said, pocketing his gloves. Or perhaps calmness is simply what guilt looks like when it has nowhere to hide. They returned to the station where the desk sergeant handed Purbright a small envelope marked undelivered. Return to sender. The handwriting was unmistakably the same as on the burned note, Mrs. Fanshaw's. Inside was a folded letter, its paper crisp and unsmudged. Purbright read silently while Mally waited. My dear A, you are right to be cautious, but by the time you read this, all shall be beyond inquiry. I have secured what we agreed upon, and will ensure it appears final. Should questions arise, they will not reach you. I trust you will remember your part faithfully. There was no signature, only an initial. Mally leaned forward. So she wrote to the solicitor again, sir? Sounds like she was planning something secret, something final. Purbright nodded slowly. Indeed, and this letter was never posted, which suggests she changed her mind, or someone else did it for her. He opened his drawer and placed the letter beside the half-burned fragment. Together they formed the beginnings of a conversation between two conspirators, one cautious, one confident, and both now unaccounted for. Sir, Mally said quietly, do you think the solicitor's involved? I think, Sergeant, Purbright replied, that if one arranges a disappearance, it helps to have a man who understands how documents vanish as easily as people. He stood and moved to the window again, where the rain had eased into a fine mist. Across the square the church bell began its slow toll for the afternoon hour, and Flaxborough went on pretending nothing strange had ever happened in its quiet streets. Purbright watched the drizzle trickle down the pane, thinking not of the missing widow, but of Miss Trent's gloved hands. So careful, so deliberate, and the way she had smiled when he mentioned the grey coat. Mally, he said at last, his voice almost conversational. Have someone checked the passenger records at the railway station for the evening after Mrs. Fanshaw's supposed death? Look for a woman travelling under any name but her own. Mally blinked. You think she really left, sir? Purbright's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. I think, Sergeant, that Mrs. Fanshawe was never very good at staying where she was put, alive or otherwise. He turned back to his desk, eyes resting on the unsigned letter, its message both promise and confession. The words seemed to hum softly in the stillness. All shall be beyond inquiry. It was, he thought, precisely the sort of phrase a living woman might write on the eve of her own funeral. The following afternoon, a pale sun returned to Flaxborough, though it shone with a kind of reluctant civility, as if the town's recent embarrassment had made even daylight hesitant. Inspector Purbright, having reviewed the railway records with predictable disappointment, found himself once again at St. Crispin's churchyard, accompanied by Sergeant Mally and a reluctant gravedigger named Abel Tuke. The three men stood by the open grave prepared for Mrs. Fanshawe, unused, pristine, and faintly accusatory beneath the dripping yew branches. A wooden trestle still marked where the coffin had once rested before vanishing into administrative legend. Purbright regarded it with mild interest. "You're certain, Mr. Tuke, that no one's interfered with the grave since the day of the funeral?" Tuke scratched his chin, leaving a streak of soil. "Certain as I can be, sir. I filled her in myself after the vicar said there'd be no service till things were sorted."
Put a tarpaulin over it, like...
"Came back next morning, looked the same." Purbright murmured. "And the soil's not been disturbed since?"
"No, sir, I'd notice. Soil's like memory. It don't like to be rearranged." Mally crouched to examine the ground.
"Looks settled enough. What are we hoping to find, sir?" "Confirmation," Purbright said softly, "that we're chasing the right ghost." At his request, Tuke began to turn the soil again, working methodically with the spade. The sound of metal against earth had a solemn rhythm, oddly soothing in the still air. After several minutes, the top boards of the burial box came into view, clean, unblemished, untouched. Purbright knelt, running a hand along the surface.
"No nails removed?"
"No marks of entry or exit." He tapped the wood lightly, then nodded to Mally. "Let's have it open." When the lid came free, it revealed exactly what logic had already promised. Nothing. No coffin, no trace of burial, just an unbroken bed of compacted soil beneath the boards. Mally looked at him, puzzled. "So it was never placed here at all?" Purbright's tone remained even. "Precisely. Our widow was given a ceremonial hole, but not an actual resting place." Tuke crossed himself, muttering, "Never liked that woman."
"Always said she'd have the last word." Purbright rose, brushing soil from his gloves.
"Mr. Tuke, could anyone have buried a coffin elsewhere without your knowledge?"
"Not hereabouts, sir."
"Not without me or the vicar seeing. We're both early risers, him by devotion, me by habit." "Quite." Purbright turned his gaze toward the far wall of the churchyard, where ivy crept over ancient stones, like time reclaiming its debt. "Tell me, Mr. Tuke, do you recall anyone visiting the grounds late that evening before the funeral?" Tuke frowned. "Only that young Morrow lad. Came by after dark, said he'd left a tool in the shed. Looked flustered. I let him be. Figured undertakers have their own odd hours." Purbright nodded slowly. "And you're certain it was him?" "Positive. Had his overcoat buttoned up to the neck and a lantern."
"Seemed jumpy, thank you."
"That will do." As they left the churchyard, Mally spoke in a low voice. "That's twice now Stanley Morrow's been where he shouldn't. He's hiding something, sir?" "Undoubtedly," Purbright said, slipping his gloves into his pocket. "The only question is whether it's guilt or stupidity. The two are easily confused in youth." They walked toward the high street, where the gossip had reached such a pitch that even the greengrocer's stall offered free opinions with every purchase. Mrs. Glossop herself was standing outside the tea-room, confiding in a small cluster of listeners.
"Her voice floated down the street, clear as a bell." And mark my words, it wasn't a mistake at all. That coffin was switched.
"Probably smuggled off to Nottingham where her money went." Purbright passed by with his usual serenity, acknowledging her with a polite nod that carried all the conversational finality of a locked cell door. At the station, he found a small parcel awaiting him, sent from the undertaker's premises with a note in young Stanley Morrow's uneven handwriting. "Inspector, I can't keep quiet anymore. Please see inside before Uncle finds out." Inside the brown wrapping lay a small brass nameplate, the kind affixed to a coffin lid. The inscription read simply, "Mrs. Millicent Fanshawe, 1876-1954. Around the screw holes, faint circular indentation suggested it had been pried off, then refitted and pried off again. Purbright studied it in silence. "Two sets of markings," he murmured, meaning two coffins, perhaps.
"One genuine, one counterfeit," Mally frowned.
"You mean someone built another coffin for show? Or," said Purbright, "they borrowed one for the occasion." Either way, the widow's departure was planned with more stagecraft than mourning. He examined the note again.
Poor Stanley.
He's frightened, which means someone close to him isn't. His uncle? Possibly. Or perhaps the person Mrs. Fanshawe wrote to, the one she promised to see before the service. He set the plate down gently on his blotter, its dull sheen reflecting the overhead light like a secret, half-buried. Mally, find out whether Mr. Athelney has any business interests here in town, particularly among the trades who deal in wood, freight or storage. As Mally hurried off, Purbright lingered, eyes fixed on the nameplate. Something about the second ring of screw marks nagged at him. It was not merely that the coffin had been tampered with, it was the precision of the act. Whoever had removed and replaced the plate had done so carefully, perhaps to conceal not the absence of a body, but the substitution of another. He smiled faintly, not from amusement, but recognition. In Flaxborough, deceit was rarely clumsy. It tended to be neat, polite, and arranged with the same tidy morality that governed the town's window boxes. Later that evening, as twilight softened the rooftops, Purbright returned to St. Crispin's alone. The air was cool, still and faintly scented with damp earth. He paused beside the open grave once more, looking down at the undisturbed soil. An empty plot, he said quietly.
Appropriate, really.
Flaxborough always buries its truths deeper than its dead. Somewhere behind him, the church clock struck 6. The sound rolled over the graves, steady and indifferent. As Purbright turned away, already composing, in that unhurried mind of his, the next quiet question that would loosen one more stone from the facade of respectability. The following morning brought with it a fresh disturbance to Flaxborough's brittle calm. Shortly before 10, a motor car of modest elegance, a Morris Oxford, dark green and city-dusted, rolled into the square and came to rest outside the police station. From it emerged a gentleman in a grey overcoat, tall, angular, and burdened by the sort of briefcase that seemed to contain more secrets than documents. Inspector Purbright, who had been contentedly rereading a report on coffin suppliers, looked up as Mrs. Pym announced, "A Mr. Arthur Athelney to see you, sir, from Nottingham." "Says it's regarding Mrs. Fanshawe," Purbright smiled faintly. "Then by all means, Mrs. Pym, show him in before his curiosity escapes." Athelney entered with the air of a man whose confidence was being carefully rationed. He inclined his head stiffly, producing a card with engraved lettering. "Inspector, I fear this is an awkward business for us both." Purbright gestured toward a chair. "Awkwardness is the constabulary's daily bread, Mr. Athelney. Please, sit." The solicitor placed his briefcase on his knees, holding it as if to prevent confession from leaking out. "I understand you've been making inquiries into Mrs. Fanshawe's affairs." "Merely seeking to ensure her late departure was properly arranged." It seems she left more questions than possessions. Athelney gave a constrained smile.
"Yes, I suppose she did. You must understand, Inspector, Mrs. Fanshawe was a woman of, how shall I say, uncompromising discretion."
"Our dealings were entirely proper. I'm relieved to hear it," said Purbright mildly.
"And these dealings concerned?"
"A small portfolio of securities," Athelney replied, choosing his words as though they might later be subpoenaed. She wished to liquidate certain holdings quietly. There was nothing illicit in the transaction, merely a desire for privacy. Privacy from whom?
"Her relatives, I believe."
"She disliked interference," Purbright nodded, eyes half-lidded. "And what became of the funds once the securities were sold?"
Athelney hesitated.
"They were placed temporarily in trust, pending instructions. I was to receive confirmation from her within a week of the funeral, but the funeral was to mark her death."
"Yes," said Athelney, his composure faltering.
"Which makes it rather difficult to explain why I then received a telegram, 3 days after the funeral date, signed only M.F., requesting immediate transfer to an account in London." Mally, seated by the window, sat forward. "You're sure it was her handwriting, sir?" "It was a telegram," Athelney said irritably. Printed text. "But the signature was unmistakable." Purbright regarded him thoughtfully.
"Did you comply with the instruction?" "I did not," Athelney said quickly. It struck me as improper.
I wrote back, of course, but received no reply. When the newspapers began reporting that her coffin was empty, I thought it best to come in person. One does not like one's firm associated with, well, body theft. Understandably, Purbright murmured. And yet you seem peculiarly certain that Mrs. Fanshawe herself sent that telegram. Athelney shifted uneasily. Because it referred to details known only to us both, figures, dates, even the phrase beyond inquiry. I took that as her private reassurance. She'd used it before. Purbright glanced at the drawer where the unsent letter lay.
Yes, I believe she had. Athelney clasped his hands. Inspector, may I ask, do you think she's alive?
Purbright considered the question as one might weigh a coin of dubious mint. Alive, he said at last, is a word that covers many states of being. I think Mrs. Fanshawe intended to remove herself from scrutiny. Whether she succeeded depends on how one defines resurrection. The solicitor frowned. If she has vanished deliberately, I could be in serious trouble. The funds, nearly £8,000, are still under my name pending her confirmation. The bank is already making polite noises about irregularities. Purbright rose, taking his hat from the stand. Then perhaps, Mr. Athelney, you'd care to accompany me on a short drive. I believe you may find our next discovery both relevant and regrettable. An hour later, they arrived at the undertaker's premises. Mr. Morrow greeted them with the humility of a man who had lived too long among coffins to be surprised by human frailty. Inspector, this is a very great strain upon our professional standing, he began, wringing his hands. But I've done as you asked, brought out the spare coffin we mentioned. The spare rested on trestles in the dim workshop, its varnish dulled by dust. The air was thick with sawdust and formality. Purbright approached, running a gloved hand along the lid. This was the coffin prepared for Mrs. Fanshawe, was it not? Morrow nodded miserably. So we thought. But this one's been used, sir. Recently, Athelney stared. Used how? Purbright lifted the lid an inch. Inside, lined with faded velvet, were faint marks where something heavy had lain. Not a body, but perhaps another coffin, smaller, hastily fitted. He lowered the lid again. It appears, gentlemen, that our widow was rather industrious in her departure. 2 coffins, one for ceremony, one for convenience. Athelney's face had paled. Then she's alive.
She must be.
Or was, said Purbright evenly. Flaxborough is not the sort of place where one stays dead by mistake. But tell me, Mr. Athelney, did Mrs. Fanshawe ever mention anyone by the name of Phyllis Trent?
She did, he said slowly. Her companion, efficient woman.
She handled correspondence toward the end. Purbright's tone softened to near politeness. Ah, yes, efficient enough to burn half a letter and post none at all. Athelney's eyes widened.
You found them? Indeed.
They tell a story, 2 conspirators planning a quiet exodus, one with the money, one with the means. Yet somewhere between the plan and the execution, a coffin went missing and a body failed to appear. Morrow looked faintly ill.
You don't mean she's still around?
Possibly not around here, Purbright said. But people rarely vanish without leaving some trace, even if it's just the sound of someone else shutting a door behind them. He turned to Athelney. You'll remain in town for a few days. I expect you'll be needed again soon. Back at the station, as dusk gathered across the rooftops, Purbright stood by the window, watching the solicitor's car retreat down the high street. The steady hum of Flaxborough life continued. Shopkeepers closing up, lights flickering on in orderly rows, the faint echo of the church bell counting time no one wished to measure. Malley entered quietly. Sir, the telegraph office confirmed that the message Mr. Athelney received was sent from Nottingham, but paid for in cash at a sub-office near the station. Purbright nodded. A convenient place for a woman beginning a new life, or for someone pretending she had. He turned back to the window, his reflection mingling with the dimming street below. If she's alive, he murmured, then someone else has been helping her remain so. But if she's not, then that someone's been enjoying her absence far too comfortably. The clock on the wall struck 6. Outside, the last of the daylight withdrew, as if unwilling to watch the respectable town of Flaxborough slide another step into its quiet deceit. 2 nights later, the air above Flaxborough held the uneasy stillness that precedes discovery. The church bell had long finished its evening toll when a message arrived at the police station. A caretaker from the disused Wesleyan chapel on Barrow Lane had found something peculiar in the cellar. Inspector Purbright, who had spent the evening in quiet reflection over a pot of weak tea, rose without complaint and fetched his coat. The chapel had not seen a sermon in 20 years. Its windows, latticed with dust and ivy, stared blindly across the deserted street. A single oil lamp flickered near the entrance where the caretaker, a nervous man with an overdeveloped sense of foreboding, waited.
"Down here, sir," he whispered.
I went to check the drains. The boards gave way and, well, you'd best see for yourself. Purbright descended the steps with his usual calm. Sergeant Malley followed, holding a torch that sliced through the dust like a blade through fog. The cellar smelled of damp stone, wood shavings, and something faintly chemical. Against one wall, resting on 2 trestles, lay a coffin. Malley exhaled softly. "Another one, sir?" Purbright approached. The coffin was of fine make, mahogany, polished once, but dulled by time. Its lid bore faint scratches where nails had been hurriedly pried and replaced. A small brass plate gleamed dully under the torchlight, blank and unengraved. "Curious?" Purbright murmured. "A coffin without a name. It suggests either modesty or deceit, and Flaxborough has never been modest." He gestured for Malley to fetch a crowbar. The lid came away with a reluctant sigh of wood. Inside, under a layer of faded velvet, lay not the expected corpse, but a wax dummy, female, pale, and disturbingly lifelike. Its hair, real and meticulously arranged, framed a face fixed in serenity. Malley recoiled.
"My good lord, sir, it's her!"
Purbright bent closer, examining the features by torchlight. The resemblance to Mrs. Fanshawe was undeniable. The same angular cheekbones, the same faint arch to the brow. And yet there was a stillness too perfect, a lifelessness of design rather than death. "Wax," he said quietly. "A substitute fit for exhibition, not burial." He touched the cheek with a gloved hand. The surface yielded faintly cool and smooth. Whoever arranged this went to extraordinary lengths. Hair from the original, perhaps.
A morbid thoroughness. Malley wiped his palms on his trousers.
"But why hide it here?" "Because," Purbright said, "a wax corpse serves its purpose only until someone starts asking questions. Once the deception outlived its usefulness, it needed a discreet resting place." He looked around the cellar, old hymn books stacked like relics, broken pews, and the faint glint of cobwebbed candlesticks. A convenient hiding spot.
"Close enough to transport, remote enough to forget." Malley stared at the dummy, frowning. "So the real Mrs. Fanshawe, what became of her?"
"That," Purbright said, "it depends on how many times one can die for profit. Our widow may have intended to vanish cleanly, but I suspect someone decided she was more valuable gone than gone away." He turned the torch to the floor, where muddy boot prints trailed toward the stair. Fresh. Narrow. Recently disturbed, he noted. "Someone's been here since the caretaker last came down. Could it be Miss Trent?"
Malley asked. "Possible."
"Or Mr. Athelney if he's less innocent than he appears. Or," Purbright added dryly, "perhaps an enterprising undertaker in need of somewhere to store excess inventory." They photographed the scene, then arranged for the coffin to be taken discreetly to the station. As it was lifted out, a small envelope slid from beneath the lining. Purbright caught it before it fell. It was sealed with red wax, unmarked except for a faint impression, an A within a circle. Back at his office, under lamplight, he broke the seal. Inside were 2 folded pages in the same firm handwriting as the previous letters. The first was brief. "When this is found, all will have been done. I trust you to see it through. Remember the promise, no scandal, No return. The second was a receipt for a railway ticket, Nottingham to London, dated the evening before the funeral. No passenger name. Purbright sat back, weighing the papers. "So," he murmured, "our widow intended her own disappearance, but someone else ensured permanence." Malley, reading over his shoulder, said, "You think she was murdered, sir?" Purbright considered this with detached interest. Murder requires intent, Sergeant. In Flaxborough, one more often encounters adjustment. Perhaps Mrs. Fanshaw's plan simply became too convenient for someone to resist. He rose, walking to the window. Outside, the square lay under a shroud of fog. The lamplight turned the mist into slow-moving shapes, ghostly and deliberate. We now have 2 coffins, one empty, one counterfeit, and a solicitor who profits from both absence and silence. The lady herself has vanished into geography. I wonder which of her acquaintances lacks the imagination to keep her secret. Malley closed his notebook.
"What shall we do about the dummy, sir?"
"Send it to the museum," Purbright said absently. "Flaxborough has long needed a more realistic exhibit of its moral fibre." He smiled faintly at his own joke, then added, "In the morning, we'll invite Miss Trent for a conversation. Polite, of course, but I think it's time we ask her what she burned, and what she failed to burn." As he extinguished the lamp, the office fell into shadow, leaving only the faint reflection of the wax figure's face on the polished desk. For a moment, it seemed almost to breathe, the flicker of light catching the artificial eyes, as though aware it had been discovered. Purbright looked at it a moment longer, then murmured, "A fine piece of craftsmanship. A pity truth in Flaxborough is never half as well made." The room went dark, and the town outside settled once more into its quiet pretense of peace, unaware that its dead were multiplying even without bodies. The morning after the discovery at the chapel was clear and deceptively gentle. Mist hung over the river like a pale curtain, blurring the warehouses and willow branches into a soft watercolour. Inspector Purbright, who rarely allowed himself the luxury of leisure, had chosen this hour for quiet thought. He stood by the stone parapet of the old bridge, hands in his coat pockets, watching a small flotilla of ducks paddle in slow,
meaningless circles. They reminded him, not without irony,
of Flaxborough itself, content, well-fed, and entirely oblivious to the darker currents beneath its placid surface. The town would already have absorbed the news of the wax woman, as Mrs. Glossop had christened it before breakfast. By now, gossip would have transformed the matter into a tale of séances, smuggling, or satanic art. Flaxborough's appetite for the macabre was exceeded only by its capacity for self-satisfaction. Purbright watched a duck dive,
vanish, and reappear 10 feet downstream, shaking droplets from its feathers with dignified futility.
"Efficiency without progress," he murmured.
A familiar habit. Behind him came the faint crunch of footsteps.
Sergeant Malley appeared, holding a folded newspaper and wearing the expression of a man who carried both duty and indigestion. "Morning, sir." The Chronicle's at it again. They're calling it The Widow's Resurrection. Reckon the editor's trying to sell twice as many copies by burying her twice. Purbright accepted the paper, scanning the headline with mild amusement. "At least they haven't accused us of witchcraft yet. I suppose that will be tomorrow's edition." He handed it back. "Anything useful among the sensationalism?" "Only that people are saying the dummy was made by a theatrical supplier in Nottingham."
I checked, it's true. A man named Merton confirmed he sold a wax figure to a lady matching Miss Trent's description 2 weeks before the funeral. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Interesting."
"And yet Miss Trent swore she never left Flaxborough." "Yes, sir. Either she's lying or someone used her name." "Or," said Purbright thoughtfully, "both."
Lying and lending a name are seldom far apart in this town. He turned back to the water, where the sunlight now caught the ripples in long, shimmering lines.
"Do you know, Malley, this business has all the elements of a proper morality play. Greed, deceit, a touch of melodrama. Yet what intrigues me most is its restraint. Everything done with care, with polish, Even the counterfeit corpse was made tidy, Mally frowned.
You think they plan to keep it secret forever?
No, Purbright said, his tone gentle but certain. Secrecy is never the true goal. It's control of the story of appearances. Mrs. Fanshawe wanted to vanish on her own terms, to manipulate death as she had life. But someone else wanted to decide when and how the curtain would finally fall. He drew from his pocket the small envelope marked with the wax seal of an A. This was no spontaneous act. Two people planned it, a solicitor with access to her fortune and a companion with access to her daily life. Yet one of them miscalculated. Perhaps they quarrelled, or perhaps greed grew impatient. Mally looked uneasy. You think Miss Trent killed her? Purbright didn't answer immediately. The river flowed beneath them, smooth and secretive, as if listening. I think Miss Trent has been rehearsing composure for weeks, but her performance faltered when we mentioned the undertaker's nephew. She asked too little about what we knew. Innocent people tend to ask too much, Mally nodded slowly. And Mr. Athelney?
A man of law, said Purbright.
Which makes him both cautious and cowardly. If he profited from her death, it was through paper, not blood.
No, Mally, the sharper blade lies nearer home. A barge moved downstream, its engine thudding softly.
Purbright watched it glide beneath the arch of the bridge. Consider the order of events, he said. A coffin sealed, then emptied. A companion calm enough to report a death. A doctor who sees what he expects to see, and a solicitor who receives confirmation from beyond the grave. It's not merely fraud, it's choreography, Mally whistled low. You mean it was all staged? Exactly. But the encore came too soon. The second coffin, the wax substitute, it was meant to buy time. Perhaps to claim the money, or perhaps simply to delay discovery until both conspirators were safely away. He paused. But one of them stayed behind. Mally thought for a moment, then said, Miss Trent. Purbright smiled faintly. Very good, Sergeant. And the question we must ask her is why?
Love? Loyalty?
Fear? Or perhaps she stayed because Mrs. Fanshawe no longer could. The ducks had drifted closer, quacking with the innocent persistence of those untroubled by philosophy. Purbright tossed a crumb of bread into the water and watched it vanish instantly. There's our town again, he said softly. Always hungry, always swallowing what floats by without asking where it came from. Mally folded the newspaper under his arm. What now, sir? Now, Purbright said, straightening, we invite Miss Trent for a little conversation at the station. Nothing formal. Tea, civility, and one or two impolite questions. People often confess in tone before they confess in words. They began to walk back toward the square, their footsteps echoing lightly on the cobblestones. The air was bright now, almost cheerful, as if Flaxborough itself had decided the worst was over. But Purbright knew better. The town's calm, like the rivers, ran shallow above the silt of secrets. As they reached the bridge's far end, he glanced once more at the flowing water. Do you know, Mally, he said quietly, the truth has a peculiar habit of surfacing, usually when someone tries too hard to keep it submerged. He smiled to himself, that small, unreadable smile that hinted at conclusions still unspoken, and turned his steps toward the station where Miss Trent's composure, like the riverbank after rain, was about to be gently but inexorably eroded. Miss Phyllis Trent arrived at the station promptly at 4 o'clock, dressed in the same black ensemble she had worn to the widow's service, or rather the attempted one. Her manner was calm, her stride measured, as though she were arriving for tea with a vicar rather than an interview about fraud, forgery, and possible murder. She was shown into Purbright's office where the inspector himself stood by the window gazing out at the square. Miss Trent, he said pleasantly as she entered, you're very punctual.
I do appreciate that quality. It so often saves embarrassment later on. She inclined her head slightly.
One does one's best to accommodate the police. Purbright gestured toward the small table where a pot of tea and 2 cups awaited. You're kind to assist us.
I thought we might discuss a few matters in comfort.
The chairs here are considerably less forgiving than those at Widow's Lodge." Her mouth tightened, but she sat, smoothing the hem of her skirt. "If you wish to ask questions, Inspector, I'll answer what I can. I've already told your sergeant everything I know." "Indeed," he said mildly, pouring tea with the precision of a man who believed in the moral value of symmetry. "But you see, Miss Trent, memory has a curious way of improving under gentle provocation. It can be as shy as truth itself." She accepted the cup without reply. "I'm afraid," he went on, "that the situation has grown rather complicated. You may have heard we found a coffin in a chapel cellar." Her hand paused halfway to her lips.
"I did hear that," she said carefully.
"A grotesque discovery.
"How could something like that happen here?"
I was hoping you might tell me." She placed the cup down with deliberate care. "I had nothing to do with any coffin beyond arranging flowers for Mrs. Fanshaw's." "Ah," said Purbright. "Then you weren't aware that the coffin discovered was identical to hers in size and make, and contained a wax figure resembling her in every detail?" Her composure cracked by the faintest degree. "You're mistaken," she said, but her voice had grown thin. "That's absurd." "Quite. Flaxborough rarely deals in the ordinary absurd. We specialize in the expensive kind." She rose, the politeness faltering. "Inspector, I find your manner impertinent." "Please," he said quietly, motioning her back into the chair. "I mean no offense. But there's one question I must ask before you go. It's a very small question, trivial even. Still, I've found trivialities tend to behave like keys." She hesitated, then sat again, chin lifted. "Very well." Purbright looked at her over the rim of his teacup. "When you burned Mrs. Fanshaw's letters, why did you overlook the one in the grate?" The silence that followed had the peculiar density of revelation. Miss Trent's lips parted, but no sound came at first. Her fingers tightened around her gloves, twisting them into a black knot. I don't know what you mean." Purbright set the cup down. "The half-burned letter written in her hand, found in your drawing-room grate. It mentioned seeing someone before the service and ensuring the lid remained sealed. I believe you were the one she intended to see." She swallowed, colour draining from her cheeks.
"That's ridiculous. I didn't write—" "No," he interrupted softly. "You didn't write."
"You received. And you understood her plan well enough to help her carry it out, until it became inconvenient to share the reward." She drew in a sharp breath.
"You think
I think," Purbright said, "that Mrs. Fanshawe trusted you. You managed her correspondence, arranged her appointments, and likely booked her railway ticket under another name. She confided her intention to vanish, to collect her funds from Mr. Athelney once safely away. But you realized something, didn't you? That a vanished widow leaves behind no one to contest her estate." Miss Trent's voice trembled.
"You can't prove—" "I needn't prove anything yet. I merely ask questions."
"For instance, when Mrs. Fanshawe supposedly died, you alone were present. Dr. Baines saw the body only briefly and under your supervision. A sedative, perhaps, strong enough to mimic death. Then a substitution, her body exchanged for a wax likeness obtained from Nottingham. The plan was clever, Miss Trent, almost elegant. Only you misjudged one thing." Her eyes flashed with sudden fear. "What?" "The greed of your accomplice. Mr. Athelney received his instructions to transfer the money not to Mrs. Fanshawe, but to himself, under her authority. A telegram sent after the funeral, signed with her initials, gave him all the legitimacy he needed. You see, Miss Trent, your partner in crime ensured you would be left with nothing but ashes and nerves." For a long moment she stared at him, breathing shallowly. Then quietly she said, "You think I killed her?" "I think she trusted you enough to let you help her die once. Perhaps she wasn't aware she'd be obliged to do so again." The gloves fell from her hand to the floor. "She changed her mind," she said suddenly, the words breaking free like air from deep water. "That night, she said she couldn't go through with it, that she'd rather face the gossip than live as a fugitive. But Athelney had already sent the money. She said she'd go to the police. She was going to ruin everything." Purbright's voice remained calm.
And so? I didn't mean to, she whispered.
She took more of the chloral than usual. She said it would calm her before she spoke to you in the morning.
I only made sure she wouldn't wake. Her gaze drifted past him toward the window, where the fading daylight glowed faintly gold. I thought it would be simple, quiet. She wanted to disappear. I merely gave her what she wanted. Purbright rose, signalling the constable outside the door.
The difficulty with disappearances, Miss Trent, he said gently, is that they never quite include those who make them happen. She looked up at him, a strange mix of defiance and exhaustion in her eyes. Will you tell them it was quick? Yes, said Purbright softly. I think she'd have appreciated that. As she was led away, the inspector returned to the window. Across the square, the ducks had returned to the fountain, circling as they always did. He watched them for a moment, expression unreadable, then murmured, "Even in Flaxborough, truth eventually comes up for air." The following day dawned bright and windless. A clear sky stretched above Flaxborough as if to suggest, optimistically, that decency might finally resume. The town, however, was already abuzz with the discreet thrill of revelation. Mrs. Glossop's tea room had sold out of scones by 10, and the conversation had grown so richly embroidered that by midday half of Flaxborough believed Miss Trent had been caught trying to bury the vicar. Inspector Purbright, immune to civic embroidery, sat behind his desk in the calm aftermath of confession. Miss Trent had been taken quietly to the county station, where her statement, brief, precise, and without a single plea, was already being typed. She had spoken with the same neat composure she had always displayed, even in deceit. There had been no hysteria, no protest, only a final, almost grateful exhalation when she signed her name. Now, with the paperwork gathered into an orderly stack, Purbright waited. He had sent word to Mr. Athelney that his presence was required, not for accusation, but for explanation. The solicitor arrived punctually, pale and defensive, his briefcase clutched like a shield of office. "Inspector," he began the moment he was shown in, "I wish to make it clear that my involvement in this lamentable affair was purely professional. The woman deceived me as thoroughly as anyone." "Indeed," Purbright said pleasantly, motioning him to a chair. "Miss Trent tells a rather different story."
Athelney's composure faltered.
"You've spoken to her?" "I have. She was most illuminating. It seems your late client, Mrs. Fanshawe, planned to vanish, taking with her a sum which you, by convenient coincidence, controlled. You assisted in the legal arrangements. She entrusted the practical ones to Miss Trent, and both of you believed the other too dependent to betray."
A common mistake in partnerships of convenience. "That's outrageous," Athelney sputtered. Purbright lifted a hand. "Please, Mr. Athelney, outrage is wasted breath unless one's lungs are spotless."
"The telegram sent to your office, the one authorizing the transfer to a London account, was drafted by your clerk, under your instruction." Miss Trent recognized the phrasing.
"It matched a letter you had once dictated to Mrs. Fanshawe." The solicitor's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "That proves nothing."
"The clerk could have acted on your orders, yes," Purbright interrupted softly. "Precisely." He reached for a folder and drew out a single sheet, the letter fragment recovered from the fire grate. "Your initial, Mr. Athelney, pressed into red wax. Found beneath the lining of a coffin you assuredly did not construct." "I'm afraid Miss Trent's confession rather completes the picture." Athelney's shoulders sagged. "Good Lord."
"She told you everything?"
"Enough," Purbright replied. She admitted Mrs. Fanshawe's staged death, the sedative, the substitution, the exchange of letters, all quite thorough. But what she hadn't realized until too late was that your plan included her exclusion. Once the funds were secured, the lady's disappearance was to be permanent in every sense. The solicitor stared at the floor.
"It wasn't meant to go so far," he muttered.
"I never told her to kill her." "No," Purbright said, leaning back. "You merely made certain she would find herself with the opportunity and the motive neatly aligned." When Mrs. Fanshawe threatened to expose the scheme, Miss Trent ensured she wouldn't. You arranged the rest, the telegram, the transfer, the plausible deniability. Athelney lifted his head slowly, resignation creeping across his features.
And what now, Inspector? Now?
Purbright's tone was mild, almost conversational. Now you'll accompany me to Nottingham, where you'll explain to your partners how a solicitor's trust became a stage for melodrama.
I imagine the Bar Council will be particularly fascinated. Athelney said nothing further.
He rose, bowed stiffly, and allowed himself to be escorted out, leaving behind only the faint scent of tobacco and moral fatigue. When the door closed, Purbright remained seated, staring at the neat pile of files before him. It was all so precise, so domesticated, the crime of Flaxborough reduced, as always, to tidy paperwork. Murder, fraud, scandal, all manageable with forms, signatures, and tea. He stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the high street glimmered in the afternoon sun. Shoppers moved from stall to stall, pausing to exchange whispers and condolences. The ducks in the square fountain quacked decorously, as if to remind the world that not all lives were complicated. Sergeant Malley entered, cap in hand. "She's been taken off, sir."
Calm as anything.
"Said she hopes they serve proper tea in prison." "I imagine they will," Purbright said. "Miss Trent strikes me as the sort of woman who could make even confinement seem properly upholstered." Malley smiled uncertainly.
And Athelney?
"On his way to Nottingham. With luck, he'll discover that conscience travels faster by rail than greed." The sergeant hesitated. "There's one thing I still don't understand, sir. Why the wax figure?"
Why go to all that trouble?
Purbright's eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where the dummy now rested beneath a white sheet, awaiting transfer to evidence storage. "Vanity, Malley?" The late Mrs. Fanshawe wanted her death to be theatrical, not merely administrative. She was a woman who organized her own luncheons down to the flower arrangements. Why should her disappearance be any less curated? Malley nodded slowly. "Seems a waste, all that effort just to end up in the papers." "Ah, but that's Flaxborough," Purbright said gently. "Our citizens work very hard to appear respectable. Occasionally the performance goes on too long." A faint breeze stirred the curtains. The inspector turned back to his desk, closing the last file with deliberate care. "It's odd," he added, "how deceit, when stripped of its glamour, looks so pitifully domestic. A cup of chloral, a letter half-burned, a pair of gloves on a parlour chair. Great crimes in this town always begin with small courtesies." Malley cleared his throat. "Will you be taking the rest of the day, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "No, Sergeant. Paperwork waits for no man, living or dead." As Malley departed, the inspector sat once more, pen poised above a blank page. He wrote for a time, notes, dates, small observations, then paused, glancing toward the window where the late light caught the dust in soft golden spirals. Outside, the town hummed on, content in its rediscovered calm. The scandal would fade, the names would blur. Yet somewhere beneath all that polish, Flaxborough would remember.
It always did. Purbright leaned back,
folded his hands and murmured to the still room. And so ends another small rehearsal in the great play of human nature, performed,
as ever, without an audience that quite understands the script. He smiled once more,
faint and wry, then reached for his cup of cold tea and returned to his paperwork.